Welcome all. Welcome. We have tonight Ruth Ozeki, novelist and filmmaker, and also a Zen priest, all of which we'll talk about when we get a chance. But I wanted to thank Ruth especially for coming. It's very late back on the East Coast, and it's been just a pleasure to get to know your work and just a little bit to get to know you as well. And looking forward to our conversation.
Thank you so
First,
much. Yeah.
first, I think what I'd like to do is just sit for 5 minutes and let people come in, if that's okay, just for
That
a few
sounds great.
minutes.
Mm.
If you'd like an Ozeki koan to sit with, you might try this, that one that she introduced in her book, The Book. Take your shoe and put it on the table and ask it what it wants from you. Well, Ruth Ozeki is a writer of novels. She has gotten numerous awards for her book, A Tale for Time Being, which she published in 2013. She was shortlisted on the Man Booker list, and she also was shortlisted on the National Book Critics Circle, and got many awards for that book, for which are too numerous to name. And then in 2022, she won the Women's Prize for Fiction for her book, The Book of Form and Emptiness. So, Ruth, welcome.
Thank you.
And
Thank you so much.
I'd love to start with a reading if you'd
Sure,
like to.
sure. I'll just read a little bit from the face. This is confusing right now because there's two of us. So, okay, which is real, I wonder. So I'll just read from the beginning. Prologue, a koan. What did your face look like before your parents were born? I first read this koan when I was 8 or maybe 9 years old. Someone had given me a little book called Zen Buddhism, or perhaps the book had belonged to my parents and I'd taken it from their shelves, thinking that it ought to be mine. The book was small and slim, the perfect size for a child to hold. But more importantly, it had a friendly face, which made it stand out from the other duller books on my parents' shelves. A book's face is its cover, and this one, with its simple flowers against a muted orange background, appealed to me. A solid black box in the upper right-hand corner contained the title, Zen. The letters were tall and hand-drawn in a floaty white Art Nouveau font that looked like ghosts dancing. Beneath, in very small caps, was the word Buddhism. Inside the cover was the subtitle, An Introduction to Zen with Stories, Parables, and Koan Riddles of the Zen Masters, decorated with figures from old Chinese ink paintings. An exceedingly long subtitle for such a small book. It was published in 1959 by Peter Pauper Press, and I know this because I did an online image search for Zen Buddhism Small Orange Book, and there it was, a familiar face, instantly recognizable, looking out at me from my computer screen after more than 5 decades. The little book was a talisman, a teacher, and a gate. It was filled with gnomic tales of old Zen masters posing paradoxical questions that confounded my 9-year-old notions of rational narrative in a way that I found both fascinating and perplexing, and so I assumed they must be very profound and wise. What is the sound of one hand clapping? How can one catch hold of emptiness? Does a dog have Buddha nature? When there is neither I nor you, who is it who seeks the way? Listed like this, these koans might sound cliched, but they were brand new to me. The crazy old Zen masters with their staffs and whisks and comic antics, who were always slapping and cuffing each other, cutting off their arms and eyelids and pulling each other's ears and noses, seemed to hold a key to my 9-year-old identity. What is your original face? I read the koans earnestly, searching for an answer.
I love that because that the book, The Face, even though it's a very slim volume, is really a wonderful vehicle for your whole life. And you very early on you were exposed to Zen.
Yeah, I was. It was funny because I got this assignment to write this. It was just supposed to be an essay about my face, right? And it wasn't in a Zen context or anything like that. It was a small publishing house that was asking um, inviting authors to write about their faces, right? And the other authors who were invited to do this, I admired them, and I thought, oh, that would be great. I'd love to be a part of that. And so I said yes. And then you know, when I actually had to sit down and write this thing, I suddenly realized, like I've agreed to write a long form essay about my face, and this just suddenly seemed like a terrible idea, right? And so I procrastinated for about, I don't know, about a year, 2 years, and finally then I did what we do in Zen, right? You sit down and confront the problem, and so what I ended up doing was putting a mirror in front of my altar, right, and sitting there and for 3 hours, staring at my reflection, sort of meditating on it and allowing sort of memories to arise, thoughts and memories and, all sorts of stuff. And I kind of made a time code of that and then used that as a way to branch off and write these little autobiographical essays. And of course, as soon as you start to study your face, you start to see your ancestors, right? You start to see your parents, certainly, and your grandparents. And so it became a vehicle for this autobiographical exploration of my face. And of course, one of the one of the first things that I thought of was my Japanese grandfather, who was a Zen practitioner. And I think, seeing his face was probably one of my earliest memories as a child. I think I was 3 years old at the time.
Yeah. You came in. If I understand it right,
Yeah.
from you came in while they were sitting
Yeah,
zazen,
that's
and you were
right.
kind of
That's right.
surprised.
Well, it was so funny because they had, they lived in Hawaii and they had just come to visit us. My parents and I were living in New Haven, Connecticut, and I was 3 years old. And my mother sent me in. Oh, they arrived at night, late at night, and they were sleeping in my parents' bedroom, which meant that they must be very important people because they had displaced my parents, right? And my mother sent me in to, call them for breakfast. And I remember, I remember standing, this is the memory that I have, standing at the door, right? And being really little and reaching up to the doorknob and turning the doorknob and opening it and looking into the bedroom and seeing my grandfather sitting there on the floor, cross-legged, kind of rocking back and forth, right? And he must have heard the door and he opened his eyes and he looked at me, right? And because he was sitting on the floor, he was my height, right? So we were, our eyes met in this way that I was not familiar with because, in New Haven, Connecticut in 1956, grown-ups didn't sit on the floor, right? And so, our eyes met, and it was this moment of, it was this kind of profound moment of, I think I was scared more than anything else, right? And I remember running out and telling my mother this, amazing thing that I had just seen. And eventually she, probably not when I was 3, but later on, she must have described to me that she didn't use the word meditating. She said that they were doing breathing exercises, right? And And in order to explain the rocking back and forth, she took my Daruma doll, right? My Bodhidharma, my Daruma doll. It is this kind of a Japanese doll that has no legs, right? And the thing about a Daruma is that you push it and it rights itself, right? And so she used that as an example of what it was that they were doing. And then I remember she told me this. This is what stuck in my head too, was that she told me that Daruma was a famous, Zen person who had meditated for so long that his legs had fallen off. And then, in Japan, the Daruma has no, the eyes are blank, right? And they're just white circles, right? They have no eyeballs in them. And she told me that it was because Daruma had, when he was meditating, he would get sleepy. And so he plucked off his eyelids and threw them on the ground. And that was where the first tea plants came from, right? So
right.
all of these kinds of memories, I think she must have told me this over the years, but they were all kind of mixed up in my early impressions of Zen.
Right. And then you lived in Japan for like 8 years, in Kyoto for 8 years. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Is
yeah.
that where you first started sitting?
No, no. When I was in Japan, I was studying, I went there to study Japanese. Um, but I was really more involved in the Zen arts at that time.
Hmm.
I had learned to meditate in the US when I was, a teenager. I think I started with transcendental meditation when I was 13 or something. But then when I was in Japan, I was really studying the Zen arts. And so I was studying ikebana, flower arrangement, and also Japanese no drama, and chanting and dance. Yeah,
I see.
yeah.
And so where did you start? And then later, I mean,
Oh,
you
the
became a priest.
oh
You're
yeah. Well,
yeah.
yeah. I had this long. I think after I saw my grandfather when I was that little, I was always curious about it. And, it was the 1960s and, you know, cool people were meditating. And so I remember, trying to teach myself how to meditate with the help of this little, the little book, right? And then, yeah, when I was 13, I was initiated into transcendental meditation. And then when I was in Japan, was doing these different kinds of Zen arts, which involved some meditation, but that wasn't the primary focus. But then it was really much later when I was living in New York, and my parents by then were, getting old and sick, and I'm an only child, and so it became clear that I was going to be the one to be taking care of them. And I just realized I needed some help. I didn't have the backbone to do it on my own. And I got involved with the Shambhala tradition in New York. And started sitting with the Shambhala group there, and with Judy Leaf, who was my teacher then. And so it wasn't really until, and so I did that for several years. But then when I moved to the Pacific Northwest, I think it was around 2000 that I met Norman Fisher. And that was, interesting to me because, of course, Norman came from a Zen lineage, and that was the lineage that my grandparents had been practicing in. But here I was in the west coast of Canada, sitting with a Zen teacher who was a Jewish guy from Pennsylvania, right? Um, and that seemed just about right to me.
I'm curious, was there any touchstone for you, in your study of no, which you were pretty deeply involved with? Was there anything that you felt there as sort of, a source of inspiration for you to practice?
Well, the no singing and certainly dance, the shimai it's called, is it's a very slow, extremely mindful movement practice. And it has Zen, it has Buddhist roots. And so I think that just, sort of being involved with that was important. And, we practiced at a temple. The practice sessions, Okeiko, were all done at a temple. And so I think, I was certainly very aware, and I was aware too of the, I mean, it's Kyoto, right? You can't go anywhere without bumping into temples, right? So I was certainly aware of, of Zen culture then. I also, when I was first went to Japan, I went on an exchange program, and I was at Doshisha University in Kyoto. And the professor who was leading that program was Taitetsu Unno sensei, who was a Pure Land Buddhist priest and teacher, who taught at Smith College, which was where I was a student as well. And so, Tai was one of my, my onshi, my close teachers. And so I think that was, it was coming at me from, I didn't stand a chance. It was coming at me from all directions.
And then you took the step in 2010 to
Yeah,
shave
yeah,
your head,
yep,
become a priest, which is
yeah,
that's a big deal. That's dedicating
yeah,
your life
yeah,
to
yeah,
the practice, right?
yeah, yeah. I think the, I took the, I did Jukai, the initial lay precepts in 2005. And then I think too, at that point, my parents, by then, both of them had died. And the Zen practice had really, really helped me tremendously during the time. My mother had Alzheimer's, and so we took care of her on this island in British Columbia, where we lived at the time. We'd been taking care of her for about 5 years or so, and it was really, I don't think I would have been able to do that if I hadn't had the Zen practice. Again, it was this idea of really having a backbone, having the strength to do this. I mean, there's a reason why sickness, old age, and death is, is so important, I think, in the, origin story of Buddhism, right? And I think certainly in Japan too, most people have practice in different kinds of religious traditions. What is it? You're born Shinto, you marry Christian, and you die a Buddhist or something like that, right? In Japan. So there was this sense that as you get older, right, you turn towards Buddhism. And I think that was clear to me that there was a reason for that. And when I was taking care of my parents and really bringing them through, the last years of their life, the Zen practice was so important to me. And I think I just realized then that I don't have children of my own. My parents, had died, and I realized that this idea of lineage was really important to me. I just wanted to be a chain in the, a link in the chain of transmission. And so it was really that desire more than anything else, to share these teachings that had been so important, for me. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you for that. Should we jump into a novel?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. How about a tale for time being?
Yeah, yeah,
You
yeah.
know, you had me at the first sentence. Could you just you've
Let me see if I
memorized
can
the beginning?
let me see if I can remember it. Yeah. Hi, my name is Now, and I'm a time being. Do you know what a time being is? Well, if you give me a moment, I will tell you. A time being is someone who lives in time, and that means you and me and everyone else, everyone who is or was or ever will be, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, yeah. That's
Yeah,
so
yeah,
fabulous because for
yeah,
me, after reading the book, you come back to that line, and it sort of encapsulates
Yeah.
all that follows in the
Yeah.
novel.
Yeah.
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 And you mentioned your mother, and there's some really strong autobiographical elements, aren't there,
Yeah. Yeah.
in that book?
Yeah.
And can you tell us a little bit about the book and about your writing of the book, Ruth?
Yeah, sure, sure. Boy, that was a hard book to write. It took me about 10 years, I think, to write it. And I was trying to write it during this period when I started it during the period when I was taking care of my mom, and finished it in 2013. So, I'd been working on it for quite a long time. Um, I think that eh, the voice of the protagonist, Nao Yasutani. She's a young Japanese girl who grew up in Silicon Valley, whose father was involved in the tech world. And during the tech crash, the dot-com, bubble, when that burst, the family moved back to Japan. And, because she had no grounding in Japanese culture, she ended up going to a Japanese school, and ended up getting terribly bullied. So it was a story about the part that I just read, or that I just recited, was from her diary, right? And so she's writing this diary, and she has this sense that there is a reader out there, somewhere out there in the world, who would find the diary and pick it up and read it. And so she's talking to that reader, right? She's writing to that reader, and she has, she doesn't know who the reader is, but she has all the confidence of a young writer who just, sort of casts her words out into the world, as we do, especially now, and with the assurance that she thinks somebody is going to be out there to find this. The problem is that she didn't know who her reader was, and so neither did I. And so my job as the writer was to try to figure this out, and that's what took me so long. I spent about probably a good 8 years or so testing out different readers, and some of them were, male, some of them were female, some of them were young, some of them were old, and none of them, it would work for a while. The reader would find the diary and would start to respond. It's told in alternating chapters, and so the reader would start to respond, and then now would respond to the reader's curiosities, and go back and forth like that. But then at some point, I would realize that I'd open up the manuscript and realize, oh, this just really isn't working. It was like the fictional world had just kind of deflated. And at that point, I'd have to usher that reader out and think of a new one, and, try that out. So I went through about 5 or 6 readers, I think, during the process. And finally, I realized that I finally finished a draft of the book, with a completely different reader in place, and not the book as it stands now. But that was just, in 2011, when the Tohoku earthquake and tsunami happened, right? And I was just about to submit the book to the publisher and to my editor at that point, but then the earthquake happened, and that literally just kind of broke the fictional world of the book. I mean, I have friends and relatives in Tokyo and Sendai. And so, we remember what that was like, to watch the tsunami sort of just wiping out, huge swaths of the Japanese coastline. And towns and villages and people just being swept out to sea. And so it was a terrifying time. And somewhere in there, I realized that, that this event that had sort of broken the world, had also broken the fictional world of my novel, and that I just couldn't go forward with it. There's certain events like 9/11 was like that. And the pandemic is like that, that cause a kind of rift in time. And so we talk about, sort of pre-pandemic, the pre-days and then the post-days, right? The before times and then the after times. And the earthquake and tsunami was like that. And so I realized that I just couldn't go forward with it. And so I withdrew the manuscript. And then I didn't know what to do, right? I had this manuscript that wasn't working. And that's when I was talking to my husband, Oliver. And if you've read A Tale for the Time Being, Oliver, right? And Oliver said, that the only way to move forward with this, given the fact that the earthquake and tsunami had kind of broken the fictional world of the book, the only way to move forward with it was to acknowledge the brokenness of the world, right? And the way to do that, the way to acknowledge the brokenness of a fiction, is to step into the fiction as a real person, right? And so that's what he said. You have to be the reader. You have to be Now's reader. The Now's reader has to be Ruth, and it has to be an autobiographical character, so that readers, when they pick it up, right, and read the book, they won't know quite whether this is real or fictional. In other words, it sort of exposes the brokenness of the fiction, right? And so that was, how that whole thing came about. And so I ended up taking the manuscript and unzipping it, right, and throwing away about 350 pages. And then writing Ruth and Oliver's. I mean, because I told Oliver, I'll be in the book, but you have to be in the book too, right? And so he agreed. And so then I started writing Ruth and Oliver's sections kind of into the manuscript like this. And that's the book that I ended up with. And it was a difficult, but also it taught me a lot about writing, and about writing as a kind of act of faith, right? That you and also an exercise in not knowing. Suzuki Roshi talks about, Suzuki Roshi talks about beginner's mind, but there's the wonderful koan, not knowing is most intimate, right? And I think that that practice of not knowing, and it is a practice, right, is absolutely essential for writers, which is why, when I teach writing at college, at a university, the first thing I do is I teach my students to sit, to meditate, right? Because even if they never, they never end up writing fiction, the meditation will, I feel, help them. So
right. There's a lot there. I'd like to.
There's a lot there. I'm sorry. I just
I'd like to unpack a couple of those points,
yeah,
actually.
yeah.
One is that you've talked a lot about embodiment, and you've talked about, for example, when Naoko feels a fish inside her body, and she embodies that. And I think what I'm hearing you say as an author is you have to live that embodiment. You have to realize that yourself in your own body, to really communicate it clearly to others.
That's absolutely right. And it's interesting because so much of meditation is framed as something we do with our minds, and yes, that's true. But I think, the place we start is with the body. And so the idea of really learning to settle into the body and trust the body, and understand that the body is the place that we can come back to when our minds go spinning off, right? So this idea of, meditation as a practice of return, right? Returning to the body, returning to the breath. And this is, I think, it's so foundational, right? One of the Buddhist teachings that I like uh, that I really have come to appreciate, I think, especially as a writer, is this idea that you know, in the West we have, you know, five senses, right? Five sense gates: eyes, ears, nose, mouth, tongue, and body, right? Or skin. But in, you know, in Buddhism, there's six sense gates, right? And the sixth sense gate is the mind, right? And the senses that are perceived by the mind with the, you know, through the sense gate of the mind, are thoughts and emotions, right? And so I think that's a really, you know, that's interesting to me, because it means that thoughts and emotions, which we take so seriously here in the West, right, are just as fleeting and ephemeral as, you know, you know, a beautiful sound or a harsh smell, right? And that's, I think, for writers, that's kind of an interesting um, way of experiencing language, right? A way of experiencing thinking. And you know, again, the, you know, coming from a Soto Zen tradition, you know, I think about Dogen and his instruction, you know, think not thinking. How do you think not thinking? Non-thinking, right? And so I think that teaching is very much a teaching about, you know, about um, being in the body, right? Really being sort of grounded and centered in the body. So when I teach my students to do this, you know, at first we practice in a you know, a meditation context, but then I encourage them to use that same body awareness when they're writing. So if they're writing a character, so for example, when you mentioned the fish story, right? It was at a moment when now the little girl is, it was a moment of extreme anxiety for her, right? And so normally, you know, in a moment like that, um, you know, very often we'll think in cliche, right? We'll think about, you know, sort of rapidly beating hearts and sweating palms and, you know, all of the kind of cliche, you know, signals of anxiety and fear and nervousness. But you know, what I'm trying to do in those situations is to kind of drop back into the body. And I mean, this is what I do when I'm writing. I, you know, drop back into the body, I close my eyes, and I put myself in the body mind of that character, of that little girl, in this extremely, you know, anxiety provoking moment. And in that body mind, basically look around, open up all the sense gates, you know, so that I'm aware of what I'm hearing. I'm aware of what's in the room. I'm aware of what's happening inside my body, what's happening outside my body, you know, and then write from that place. And one of the images that came up for me when I was doing this was this image of a dying fish, right? And so that's how now ended up describing that anxiety, that feeling of anxiety, that there was a you know, a fish dying just below her rib cage, and it was thrashing, right? And it was struggling for breath. And so that image ended up then being an image that literally swam through the entire novel and kept popping up in different places. But it you know, it was rooted in, as you say, you know, in this this very embodied way of well, you know, a way of being in the world, but also a way of being in a fictional world.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, this notion of personal experience, of embodiment, of
Yeah.
you very courageously have touched on some pretty tough personal things that you personally
Yeah.
experience. You know, we're talking here suicide, bullying. Uh, what was your
Yeah.
experience in that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, you know, the Now section in the book, you know, Now's diary, I mean, she is being bullied in school, and she has decided that she's going to kill herself. But she's not going to do that until she tells the fascinating life story of her 103-year-old great grandmother, who is a Zen Buddhist nun. right? And so she sets herself this task, right, of doing that. And one of the things that I think people ask me all very often, how is it that I can write in the voice of a suicidal 13-year-old girl? And, it's obvious because, I was a suicidal 13-year-old girl. And to some extent, that girl is still with me, right? I mean, I haven't, I haven't abandoned her. She's still very much with me. And so I think that these kinds of mental health struggles are ones that I'm very familiar with from my own childhood, and it's the place. I mean, it was a difficult time. Oops, I'm hearing. Oh, there. Okay, yeah, it was a struggle at the time, but it's also. I mean, I think that's where fiction comes from. That's where story comes from. I can't think of a single um novel that doesn't involve some kind of suffering, right? I mean, it's the first noble truth, and it's also the first noble truth, of fiction. And so, for me, um fiction is my way of trying to understand what it was that happened to me in the past. And you know uh, I think for me, and for now too, what saves her is her writing, right? And I think that's certainly what saved me too. This idea that that as long as you could continue to tell a story, right? As long as you could continue, to write, right, that you'd be okay. And so now, of course, when she's writing her diary, I mean, she's trying to tell the life story of her 103-year-old great grandmother, but she's just a kid. And so her own life is you know far more fascinating to her, right? And so she's continually telling stories about her own life. And I really thought of it as a kind of Scheherazade story, that as long as she keeps writing, as long as she keeps going in her diary, that she would be fine, she would be okay, she would survive. And yeah, so that was very much, I think, based on my own experiences when I was that age.
Yeah, yeah. Um, Another device that you use in the novel towards the end are dreams, and you
Yeah.
actually, in your dreams, you meet all of the major characters, all of the, you meet now, you meet her great grandmother, you meet her father. In fact, you convince her father not to commit suicide. You change history, perhaps. Could you tell us about your work with dreams and what it
Yeah.
means to you in your novels?
Well, I was thinking the title, A Tale for the Time Being, is taken from, inspired by a Dogen essay, Dogen Zenji essay called Uji, or Time Being, or Being Time, right? It depends on how you translate it. But and so in this essay, which is a beautiful essay, Dogen is talks about how time works, right? And and that time is not linear, right? And we know this, right? But so time is not linear, and that you can move forward and backwards in time. Time is flowing, right? And so that's what dreams are like too. I think dreams often do not emerge according to any kind of linear time. um we don't experience them in a linear kind of way. And also, in the course of the novel itself, novels have to be read chronologically, more or less. I mean, I think there are probably ways of messing with that, but generally novels are read chronologically. But the idea of being able to kind of travel backwards in time, what I was trying to do was to take Dogen's notion of time and enact that on the page. Right. I was trying to sort of perform being time, or time being on the page. I wanted the book to function in on a psychological level, on a, quantum level, on a, Buddhist Dogen level. I wanted it to be able to function in many, many different ways. And so, yes, the moment when Ruth, the character Ruth, goes back in time and meets Now's father, that was a kind of time, a time flowing in a different direction.
Yeah, yeah, and it changed the course of the novel.
It did.
I
Yeah,
thought it was
yeah, yeah,
really
yeah, yeah,
really
yeah.
fascinating. Could we go to the book? Could we
Yeah,
touch
sure.
on the book a little
Yeah,
bit? Your
yeah.
latest work. Um, some reviewers have said that your novels are getting stranger and stranger.
Oh,
I, for
good,
one, don't
good,
believe that.
good. I'm glad. I try very hard to. I'm not. I try very hard to, you know, to defeat my mundane quotidian mind. If left to my own devices, I'm pretty boring. So I am trying very hard all the time to try to break out of that, you know, that quotidian mindset. So if my books are becoming strange, that delights me. I think that's great.
Yeah, you even have a quote about how Buddhism has helped me stay with things that are unconventional. You said that,
Yeah,
yeah, that now, for example, cuts on her body from Ijime to sink into the scene and understand,
yeah,
visualize. So your
yeah,
practice helps you. So the
yeah,
book is again about a troubled adolescent
yeah.
whose father Kenji is run
Mhm.
over by a chicken truck.
Yeah.
He's a jazz musician player, and it's a very tight family with Annabelle and Benny and Kenji, and it just totally breaks apart their family.
Yeah.
He falls apart, the young man falls apart, and the mother falls apart in trying to help him. Can you tell us how did that book come together?
Yeah. Well, in the same way that A Tale for the Time Being was kind of inspired by Dogen, and by this notion of time being, this book was really inspired by, I think, initially inspired by this idea of insentient beings, and the question, the kind of Zen Dongshan question: do insentient beings speak the Dharma? And who can hear the Dharma expounded by sentient beings? And this, so when Benny, who has suffered this trauma, he develops the ability to hear the voices of things, objects speaking to him, right? And so the question is raised, is this kind of a superpower, or is he sick? Is this a problem of mental illness? And I think that's the question, what is normal, right? What is our relationship to voice hearing, right? These are the questions that really sort of permeate this novel. So the idea of this little boy who starts to hear voices, I'm not sure exactly where that character came from, but I just know that one day I was writing this scene of this little boy walking through a corridor, on his way to the bathroom at night, and hearing the voices of a broken Christmas ornament, um, speaking to speaking, and yeah, and so it was really, again, the initial, um, I think, inspiration for it very much came from this, the koan, and also I think from, the title, of course, comes from the Heart Sutra,
Sure.
right? And so that was also, you know, something that I was thinking about as I was writing this. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And Benny, again,
Mm.
he visits a psych ward, and
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
um, some bit of autobiography, I guess, but
Yeah. Yeah.
is really struggling with
Mm.
with coming of age, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, Benny, I mean, this was, I think, part of my, sort of exploration of emotional and mental struggles, teenage, mental struggles. And certainly, I'm not a voice hearer myself, but I have had the experience of um hearing a voice as if with my ear, as if it's kind of outside me. It happened after my dad died, and for about a year or so after he died, I would be doing something really kind of ordinary, like washing the dishes or folding laundry or something, and I would hear him um, standing behind me, and he would clear his throat and and then say my name, speak my name. And every time this happened, I would kind of whip around to see him. And when I looked, he wasn't there, of course, because he was dead. And every time this happened, it was a kind of this feeling of like, just being punched in the stomach, right? And this happened, as I don't know, 5 or 6 times, 4 or 5 times over the course of about a year, maybe. It happened so quickly that, and it was just such a kind of flash of a moment that I didn't really hang on to it. And then it stopped. And so I kind of forgot about it. But then I was talking about novel writing. I was talking about how characters' voices come to me, like the voice of Now, for example. That was, in her case, I heard her voice, right? Hi, my name is Now, and I'm a time being. Do you know what a time being is? And that was the voice. I kind of heard it, um, and wrote it down, and the book kind of emerged from there. And I was speaking about it like this at an event, and somebody in the audience, a man in the audience, raised his hand afterwards and asked me, when I talked about hearing the voice of a character, did I mean that I was hearing it um, with my ears as if the voice is on the outside of my head, or is it a more internal kind of hearing? Um, and of course, not of course, but in my case, for the characters, it is a kind of more internal hearing. It's different than thinking, but it is more like hearing it, but it's as if I'm hearing it with my mind, right, with the sense gate of my mind. And the reason, anyway, make a long story short, the reason that the man was asking me was because his son heard voices. His son was a voice hearer who heard very disturbing voices, as if with his ear, as if they were on the outside of his head. And they caused him, tremendous distress. And so that really got me thinking about the ways that we talk about and the ways that we think about voice hearing in our culture, and how voice hearing used to be thought of in a very different way, and still is in many cultures. But how in the West it has been so completely pathologized. And of course, this tied in very much with my own experiences, to bring it back to the psych ward, right? When I was 16, I think I was in a locked ward for probably about a month. And, this was, back in the olden days, right? Before, I mean, I was certainly taking psychopharmaceuticals back then, but um, the practice of diagnosis, right, of psychiatric illness was less developed than it is now. There just simply weren't as many, classifications of psychiatric and diagnoses of psychiatric conditions, right? And so I managed to escape being diagnosed. And this, I think, in a way was, for me, not for everybody, but certainly for me, it was very liberating, because I think if I had had a diagnosis, I think I would have latched onto it. I was at an age where I think that would have been very appealing to me. And so not having a diagnosis meant that I was, I never had to be kind of defined by that. Right. So I think, again, for me, it was it was, I feel like it was a positive thing. I know that for other people, it's not that case. That's not that way at all. So again, um, I was able to think about my, and this is how I did think about my mental distress. I always thought it was because I was an artist and a writer. And to me, that seemed like proof, that I was suffering. I was depressed. I was from time to time suicidal, and that must mean that I'm a writer, because, I mean, writers have there's a long history of women writers in particular. The women writers I admired, Virginia Woolf, um, and many others who did suffer in these ways, right? And so that was my diagnosis. That was my self-diagnosis. And it's worked out nicely for me.
So yeah, you brought that into your meditation teaching, right? Where you say,
Yeah.
you tell your students to befriend the voice. Don't try to get rid of the voices, just
Yeah.
to befriend them. Isn't
Yeah.
there's a group or an advocacy group, right, that you
That's right.
have been
That's right.
involved in?
Yeah, I'm not directly involved, but I'm friends with people who are very active in the Hearing Voices Network. And it's an there's an international advocacy group as well as a Hearing Voices USA group. And they do really amazing work. It's a peer-to-peer support model.
Mm,
And it's a non-pathologizing approach to the lived experience of hearing, not just hearing voices, but to unshared experiences, right?
mm, mm,
And that's an expression too, I think, that's interesting because it points to certainly points to what it is that I do. I mean, I write novels, and novels are unshared experiences that I have, and they're unshared until I until I share them with you, right?
yeah.
Yeah. So I think that there's I think the real question at the heart of the Book of Form and Emptiness is a question about what is normal. What I mean, normal is normal is something that we made up, right? Normal is a fiction. We made it up. We decided that this is normal, that normal goes from here to here, right? And anything outside that is not normal, right? But since we made it up, we should be able to change it, right? We should be able to make it more, more all-inclusive, more expansive, more compassionate, right? And so this is really, I think, what's at the heart of the Book of Form and Emptiness.
Yeah,
This
it's
question.
nice.
Yeah.
Were we going to do a short reading on the
Oh,
book?
sure.
Could you do that,
Yeah.
Benny, could you set it up for us? Benny's he's just been in a demonstration where he had an act of violence and etc. And please,
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so I need to set this up a little bit more because uh, the book, a lot of the book, much of the book takes place in a library, in a large public library in an unspecified city somewhere on the West Coast, kind of Pacific Northwest coast. And in the basement of the library is a defunct bindery, right? It's a public bindery where periodicals, magazines used to be bound before everything went digital. A place where bound books were also, rebound. And so this used to be fairly common in public libraries that they would have binderies in the basement. But of course, increasingly as things go digital, they're no longer needed. And so many of these binderies have closed. And so that's the situation at this library. There's a bindery in the basement. It's a large public library. There's a defunct bindery in the basement. And the bindery is a very powerful and mystical and strange place, right? And I should also mention that the narrator of the Book of Form and Emptiness is the Book of Form and Emptiness. Okay. The book is actually speaking to Benny. right? Because Benny hears the voices of objects speaking to him, and the Book of Form and Emptiness is the object and the narrator of itself and the narrator of Benny. So the book is narrating Benny into being, or is Benny narrating the book into being? It's set up as a dialogue between them, so it's a little bit hard to tell. It's kind of like the chicken and the egg. So in this moment here, Benny is in the bindery. He's just had a fairly kind of crazy experience at this large scale protest after an election, after a very disturbing election. And he's been tear gassed, and he's run away and escaped to the bindery. And so this is the moment when he and the book actually speak to, they commune for the first time in a very profound way. And so I'll just read a little bit of this section. This is the book speaking. Okay. Do you remember our conversation? Do you remember the places we went and the things we saw? The bindery was our access, the point in space that contains all other points. And that night, you were a boy unbound, a tiny astronaut, taking your first leap into an infinite and unknowable universe. For the first time, you could see the voices of the things you'd been hearing for so long, all that clamorous matter vying for your attention. With your supernatural ears, you were able to perceive with absolute clarity the sinuous shapes and contours of the sounds that matter makes as it moves through space and time and mind. Some of these sounds were so beautiful they made you laugh out loud and clap your hands with delight, and others were so sad they made tears run down your face. And, oh, the visions we had. Container ships glittering on a moonlit night off the coast of Alaska, pyramids of sulfur rising yellow in the mist, the plundered moon and all its craters, globes and stars and asteroids, a jet black crow with a diamond tiara, a flock of rubber duckies spinning through the Pacific gyres. At the sound of a footstep, a young girl freezes, and Andromeda sparkles in the firmament. Fires rage as the redwoods burn, and in the deep ocean, a pilot whale carries her dead baby on her nose, while sea turtles weep briny tears into nets of plastic. I'll just read one more paragraph. How impossible it is to put into words this infinitude of the unbound. In a single instant, we witnessed constellations on the brink of constellating, assemblages in flux. We perceived the dynamic flow of vibrant matter materializing as a marble or a baseball bat, a sneaker or a story, a jazz riff or a viral contagion, an ovum or an antique silver spoon. And so it's this moment of, when we talked about it earlier, John, you described it as a moment of kensho. And that was how I was thinking of it too, that there was a sense of just, sort of being at one with all of the unbound, the myriad things, right? The myriad things of the world.
Yeah, I love that. A boy unbound, an
Yeah.
author unbound.
I'm working on it.
Let's embody that. What I'd like to open it up to John Tarrant and Allison Atwell, and for their questions as well, and then we'll take questions from the audience. You can put your golden paw up, or write something in the margin if you'd like. But please, John and Allison, any thoughts?
One of my reactions is the overwhelming quality of the disintegrative forces in the world and the suffering in the world, and so and how closely, or in a way, how you your solution to the violence and difficulty of the world is to dive into it in a certain way. It's like sort of and every time, and then when I read it or hear you read it, then I just feel that. I feel the disintegrative forces in my own psyche, or anybody's psyche, I suppose. Case in point, my psyche. And so,
Right.
so I feel that I suppose, forces, and how fascinated you are with that. And I think in some ways you have. And I was thinking about your idea of an anti. Well, one of the things that Zen seems to offer is it's actually what you offer with Zen is a little different from what some people offer. I think. I like that it's there's some contact with the magic that sustains us anyway, or the involuntary magic. And I felt your 103 or 4-year-old grandmother by the time she dies, I think. But is she's your version of Castaneda's Don Juan or something. But she's and the way you can't rationally solve the problem of the sorrow and the violence and so on, but you can just step into some
Yeah.
other path where you're sustained by the forces that sustain us, you know. And felt I liked that, and I think your dreams do that, or
Yeah.
you're clear. And I also like the idea that the objects they start talking to you because objects kind of do have a life, and
Yeah.
they have a psyche, and they're in our
They do.
psyches, and they talk to us,
Yeah.
and I've always liked that aspect about myself, you know, and it seems a sort of Zen thing, you know, like
Yeah.
as well as the, you know, the voice of inanimate objects is the koan, you know, yeah. And so I guess I'd like you to speak a bit about the that feeling for how I suppose Zazen is well, you say a superpower in time,
Right, right.
but there is a
Yeah.
kind of magic that makes things that can't be solved, makes them discontinuous in
Yeah.
some way. And so there's that involuntary gap that allows something different to happen. You play with the quantum physics metaphor too, but
Yeah.
I think the old magic metaphor is the one that struck me.
Yeah.
And
I think, yeah. Thank you for for picking up on that. And I always think that, I'll start with a comment on the magic of fiction, because I think it relates to the magic of community and the magic of Zen practice and the magic of ritual. Reading, writing, storytelling is a form of ritual. And so when I write, I write a book, right? And it's called The Book of Form and Emptiness. And I think of it as, we think of it as an object, right? As a thing, singular, right? Um, but I don't think of it that way. I think of it as not as a noun as much as a verb, right? The book goes out into the world. I mean, I write the book, right? And then it goes out into the world, and you pick it up and you read it, right? And at that moment, right, the book becomes a collaboration. It's no longer my book. It's something that you and I have co-created, right? And that's, I think, the way that so the book is kind of almost a living I mean, that's why I think stories are alive, right? And the book is a kind of living manifestation of dependent co-arising, right? It's the back and forth. It's the relationship, right? It's the only a Buddha and a Buddha, right? And it's that kind of magic, I think, that we respond to in ritual, in Zen ritual, in our sitting meditation, especially when we sit with others, right? It's very different to sit alone, and to sit in a sangha. And it's also what we I think is what we're doing in Doksan, in face-to-face meetings. And I think too that in Japan, as of course Japan is an animist tradition, and so much of Shinto animism has animated, Buddhist traditions, and so there's a reason why, I mean, I'm just looking at the beautiful flower that's behind you, and the vase, and the little Jizo statues there. And these are powerful objects, right? They're beautiful, powerful objects that, speaking to me across this like crazy Zoom environment, right? And they mean something. And in Japan, this is not it's not a big deal. I mean, there's a reason why, so much of manga and anime comes from Japan, right? Because everything is animated, right? And so there's it's just very much a part of the culture, and it's a part of the culture that I have grown to really appreciate. And I think it's a part of the culture that animates our Zen practice as well. And that's, I think, what you're picking up on
Yeah.
in the book. And I think one of the reasons, of course, that you're picking up on it is because you're a Zen practitioner, you're a Zen teacher, and you have lived in Japan and you're familiar with that particular kind of Japanese magic.
Well, there is a certain thing about the life of inanimate things and how it speaks to
Yeah.
us. It seems profound, and also I was thinking of the. I've often thought of koans as kind of spells or
Yeah.
very short books, but your whole book is your books are kind of spells that you cast you cast upon us, and and
Yeah.
I kind of like the idea that I think that's the neglected part of Zen, where everybody tries to use Zen to tidy up the world, but
Yeah.
in a way, Zen sympathetic with the interruptions, I think, and
Ah,
the
yeah.
unpredictable, the
Yeah.
unpredictable beauties and things like that. And
Yeah.
I see that you have an interest in that. I think. And,
I think that's interesting. I think that's really interesting because, yes, I mean, Zen, haven't done a lot of koan practice myself, but um, certain not in the same tradition, but the Zen stories, koans, are very much, I mean, my understanding is it's very much about disrupting habitual mind states,
sure.
and inviting us to not just think about, but to experience, right? To perceive the world, from a different sense gate, from a different perspective. I mean, it's one of the reasons why I think one of the images in the Book of Form and Emptiness is Avalokiteshvara, the perceiver of the sounds of the world. And so there's this, this image of synesthesia runs through the book as well. And the Dongshan, um, you, you know, uh, the question about who is able to hear the Dharma expounded by sentient beings. His poem at the end of that story is a beautiful a really beautiful poem, which is extremely very much about sort of cross-sensory perception, just a way of experiencing the world yeah in a completely different way. No,
I think that's
which
true.
is yeah, which is magical.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
One of my friends was a psychiatrist who, and very deeply involved in the Dharma, who did
Yeah.
lots of surveys and concluded that people who do a lot of zazen just do have synesthesia.
Oh, that's
It's
interesting.
just like, and he couldn't. What was the cause and effect? He wasn't sure.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's interesting. I think the line is like it's like Dongshan is having his awakening experience, and he's, the Dharma expounded by non-sentient beings is, inconceivable. Listening with your ears, no sound, right? Hearing with your eyes,
Yeah,
you directly understand, right? And that is the complete disruption, you know, of our normal modes of perception, which I think is so beautiful.
I there's another thing we
Oh,
spoke about before we came on.
yeah.
I don't know if we've got time right now, and John, you can perhaps tell us. But the uh, I spoke about how our lineage actually kind of started. I got exposed to Zen through somebody who was exposed in a prison camp in Japan.
Mm.
He learned, in Japan, and so he learned to do koans and be a
Yeah.
haiku and things. And I was thinking about how then my father was, trying to understand how I could be, one of my next door neighbors was on the Burma Road, and Australia had a very
Yeah. Wow.
dark experience during the war, and Australians did, but
Yeah.
then, and so, and on the same time, the my father himself had, Chinese genes, and everybody in Tasmania had massacred the Aborigines,
Yeah.
so,
Yeah.
so it was like, it seemed like we can't find the right. We don't have, we don't have to do that.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's seemed more destructive, and so I felt quite happy about studying Japanese tradition personally,
Yeah.
because I wanted it, and I don't know. I think some of the complexity of how we're all in it, and we all have the virtue, and also the complicity, or the just being alive.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
think that Inuit saying that the sorrow of being human is in some way you kill to eat.
Yeah. 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 That's right. I mean, the growing up as half Japanese, I was a half Japanese kid growing up 11 years after World War II ended, right? And, when you think about 11 years, it's nothing. Right? 11 years was like yesterday. And so it was very confusing for me because, I didn't, I had no idea of the war.
We're the
But
good guys, right?
yeah,
Yes.
well, I mean, but which am I? Am I the good guy or am I the enemy? I mean, there was a real sense of being both, right? And that got even more confusing because my grandfather had been interned. He was not just interned, he was imprisoned in a Justice Department
Wow.
prisoner of war camp in Santa Fe, because he was really looked at as a security threat for all sorts of interesting reasons, which I only have just found out about. But so there was this identification with, Japanese as victim, and then there was a identification with, Japanese as perpetrator of unspeakable horrors. And then there was the Japanese as victim, of the atomic bombs. I mean, it was just very complicated. I had all sorts of
Well, I kind of like
yeah,
that. I like that
uh,
you allow for the complication without trying to give it an answer, because the complication is in our own hearts.
yeah, yeah,
And
right.
I've always felt, and that's why we do Zazen together, and we don't
Yeah,
care who we're with, sort of thing, and
that's right.
I kind of like that.
Yeah,
That Aiken, Robert Aiken, who was my main teacher, was he was in prison, but
yeah.
so well, I can learn something really good in this prison. This prison,
Yeah,
this
yeah,
prison. Yeah. So
yeah,
that's
yeah.
how Zen came to my little part of the.
Nice. Yeah, yeah.
I think probably we should, like I noticed,
Yeah. Allison,
I think there's a hand. I
do you have
see
any
it. Yeah.
thoughts? And then we
also
can go to
Peter
Susan.
Hershock. Peter Hershock is on, and he might have
Yeah,
some.
we have Peter Hershock and we have Frank Ostaseski. We've got David Hinton. So, hello, luminaries. You're always welcome back.
So, my suggestion is you take Alison and then some others.
Yeah, yeah, I'll do that. And then take
And
questions.
Susan.
Susan's got her hand up. Yeah, Susan
Yeah,
Pollitt
yeah.
has got her hand up.
Allison, do you have any thoughts or?
Yeah, I have a quick question,
Yeah.
sort of coming from what John was talking about too, about the deep interest in the disintegrative and unmanageable forces, both in your own life and in your history, and in the history of your countries, and in a way of all countries.
Yeah.
It hasn't allowed you to, in a way, fix on any identity.
That's right.
Which has been, in a way, the your first entry into the Zen practice.
Yeah.
But I was very interested earlier when you were speaking about your parents and how when they were very sick and you knew you had to go and take care of them, that you yourself felt you did not have it in you within your own known resources to do this. And so somehow you you had a sense that the Zen practice would offer something. And I'm interested in what, if you have any sense of exactly what you discovered or what that was in the experience of taking care of them that you found.
Well, I think, I mean, what I found, the way that Zen helped me was that it allowed me to be with the pain. You know, it allowed me to be with my own, you know, the pain of watching them suffer, the pain of, you know, of not knowing, like, you know, it's, you know, how do you sit with, you know, the pain of not knowing, you know, how to take care of your father who's dying, you know? It's you know, of course, this is and I didn't have that skill. I was still in, you know, very much in the when I, you know, when my father started getting ill, I was very much in the state of thinking that somehow this needed to be fixed, right? And there was a way to fix it, and it was my responsibility to find that way. And, you know, I was causing all sorts of, you know, additional suffering and trouble for myself by, you know, by sort of hanging on to that. You know, I was pretty desperate. And you know, Zen really helped me, just, you know, the simple thing of being able to sit and allow the feelings to, you know, to come and go, right? And to be in the same room, and to sit there by the side of, you know, my mother's bed, and you know, just be with her, take care of her, answer the same question, you know, that she's asking for the 500th time, you know, just all of the wonderful, I think one of the things about you know, about our practice is that it is a practice of patience, right? And when you're taking care of people who are certainly somebody who has Alzheimer's, patience is it's a very useful, very wonderful thing to, you know, cultivate. And I am a very, you know, impatient person. I think most writers are very impatient, you know, just by nature. We don't want to write, we want to have written. That's the, you know, and I think that that's the, you know, that's the condition. But sitting zazen, you know, and just being with all of the, you know, all of the stuff that goes on in here, you know, it taught me to just be still with that, you know, and not turn away from it. So that's, I think, why it was helpful to me. Yeah. I feel real, I mean, I just am very grateful, because I think that if, you know, if I hadn't really started practicing seriously at that point, I don't know. You know, it's hard to know what would have happened, but I'm sure that the outcome would not be, you know, would not be this.
Nice. Thank you, Ruth.
Yeah.
Susan,
Yeah.
you have any thoughts?
First, I just want to start by thanking you from my heart. I feel this is the work, your books are the works of a fearless bodhisattva. And I say that knowing it because I've been working in psych units for 40 years, inpatient, outpatient, suicidal adolescents. I mean, that's the world I've been living in. And I feel like you've given us all a tremendous gift in realizing that there are other ways. You know, you don't have to define yourself by your diagnosis. You can befriend the voices. And also, as a writer, I was so excited to see Dogen become a muse. Okay, because I was also trained as an academic, and you read the text. And as I started reading Tale for the Time Being, it was like, oh my God, Ruth brings Dogen alive, which again, I think is an enormous gift. And just one other thing I love is the way you really map out the historical family legacy of trauma.
Mm.
Yet, as John put it, there are two aspects to it. So you have the chaos, you have the biological, perhaps drive or makeup toward mental illness. Yet you also have the family have the gift of Dogen.
Mm.
So for now, Dogen isn't just something she's discovered, it goes back to her ancestors. So I feel you have given us such a wonderful universe. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I mean, I just have to say that, I mean, John, we were joking about this earlier. I kind of think of my novels as a bit of a gateway drug, to Dogen, but also to other things as well. Just the things that I'm interested in. I end up putting in the novels because I want to understand them. I want to understand them better, and that includes Dogen. I mean, Dogen's, a challenge, right? But also, the koan of mental illness is also a challenge. And I'm certainly not, you're in the trenches, Susan, doing this work. And I, many of my friends also are working in different capacities in the mental health systems, and the peer model, the peer support model is such a powerful one. But the forces of the psychopharmaceutical industry and the insurance conglomerates are very much sort of pushing towards a different model for treatment, and a more profitable model, and that's of course something that that I think is worth questioning. So thank you for bringing that up. Yeah.
Thank you, Susan.
Yeah.
Peter Hershock or Franco or David Hinton, anybody like to ask a question or any
Hi, Frank.
comments? Okay. I do have some questions to wrap up, if I might.
Yeah.
Crows. We have crows in the tale. We have crows in the book,
Yeah.
and prominently as
Yeah.
almost tricksters. Like
They
Lewis
are,
makes
aren't they?
trickster
Yeah.
makes the world, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I've just always been fascinated by crows, and living in the Pacific Northwest, it was just, and in Japan, where, oh my gosh, crows are just, everywhere in Japan. It's just a bird that I've just always been fascinated by. And in Japan, the stories about crows are, you see them all the time, right? They're always in the papers. And I just remember sitting in Japan at a crosswalk once. It was near Ueno Park, and there was a crosswalk there with pedestrian lights, and there were crows nearby, and I think there was a ginkgo tree with ginkgo nuts, right? And so the crows would pick up a ginkgo nut, fly over the crosswalk, and there were, it was a road with cars, right? And so that it would fly over the road and drop the ginkgo nut into the crosswalk, right? And then fly over to the side of the road and wait. And the cars would be driving back and forth. And then the crow would fly over to the side and wait there until the pedestrian walk sign illuminated, and all of the people walked to the center, and the crow would walk to the center of the road too and pick up the ginkgo nut that had been crushed by the cars, right? And it was this kind of thing. I mean, they're so smart and they're so ingenious, and so any chance I have to kind of investigate crows and learn more about them, I just welcome.
It's great. Some of our favorite birds too.
Yeah, they're so great.
Peter Hershock,
Cool.
you have any thoughts? Love to hear from you. Good to see you too. Yeah. You're on mute, Peter.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, there we
Yeah,
go. Hi.
it's certainly great to be here. And Ruth, I've read every one of your novels. I started in 1998 with The Year
Oh
of
my
King
gosh.
and worked my way forward. And when you hit that crossover point with For the Time Being, it's just like I thought, wow, this is the first Buddhist novel in English.
Yeah.
It worked. It's not just a novel with Buddhism in it.
Yeah.
It's a Buddhist novel.
Yeah.
And I thought, how did she pull this off? And I think for me, and let me just run this by you.
Yeah.
I think part of it's the sense that I get. You create this virtual reality. You weave a really nice narrative,
Yeah.
but you weave it in such a way that it's totally complete and also totally incomplete.
Yeah.
It's like there's 2 dimensions of time running in it, not 1 dimension of time. And it's that temporal space that opens up.
Yeah.
And when you drop into that, it's like, yes, nothing has to be the way it is.
Right.
It's such a beautiful space to be in.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I don't really so much have a question as to think
Oh,
pulling it off, because it's astonishing.
thank you. I'm so happy to hear you say that, because that space that you're describing, where multiple realities exist at once, right, is the space that I often feel as a writer on the good days, and not even the good days, the good moments, right? There are moments when time is where I can sense linear time, that there's a kind of linear time kind of moving this way, but there's also this, it's synchronic and diachronic simultaneously, right? And that is what it's like music in that regard. I mean, music does this naturally, right? Music works in harmonies, right? So there's a kind of a harmonic element. And it's also diachronic, right? So it's moving through time as well as, synchronously. And that sense of harmonic narrative is what I am really excited by. And so it requires working on multiple levels at once. And the way I think of it in my mind is as a musical staff with notes, and that makes it easier for me to conceive of. But for both of these books, and I think the way that I think about it too sometimes is it's a type of metafiction, right? So it's operating in different spheres of reality at once, and calling all of them into question. And it's it when it works, it's so exciting. I mean, I think I always wanted to be a musician, is really what this is about. But I'm not a musician, so I'm sort of stuck with language, which operates differently. It has a different kind of, physics. But when it works, it's an astonishing thing. And it's also a feeling that, the kind of felt sense of it is a felt sense that I've also had during, sesshin, where, as you say, possibilities open up. So there's many different possibilities kind of existing simultaneously, right? So to try to, I mean, this is why it takes me 10 years to write a book, because it's a long procedure. It's a long process. But thank you for reading it in that particular way, and thank you for bringing that out. Yeah.
Nice, Ruth. We have to finish. Could you read Dogen's For Time Being, the very beginning of part 1?
Yeah.
I just
Oh,
love this
yes.
verse. Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Well,
this
I
leads
have
off
to
your-
say, this is my own translation, and it's a little loose.
it's just fine.
Okay. This is the verse from Uji, right? The opening verse from Uji. An ancient Buddha once said, for the time being, standing on the tallest mountaintop, for the time being, moving on the deepest ocean floor, for the time being, a demon with 3 heads and 8 arms, for the time being, the golden 16-foot body of a Buddha, for the time being, a monk's staff or a master's fly swatter, for the time being, a pillar or a lantern, for the time being, any Dick or Jane, for the time being, the entire earth and the boundless sky.
That's so lovely. Thank you.
I took a
Thank
few
you,
liberties
Ruth,
there. Yeah.
for coming. It's just so great to have you.
Yeah,
And,
thank you.
just we've really enjoyed your books, and
Thank you so
looking
much.
forward to seeing your next project. at some
Yeah,
point.
I'm just gonna switch to gallery and say hi to everybody. Thank you so much for
Okay.
coming. Yeah.
Yeah, and thank you, John and John Tarrant and Allison Atwell and others for your comments. And so with that, we'll end the night.
Thank you.
Ruth, one wonkish
Yeah.
question.
Yeah.
Does Icon meet now on a park bench?
Yes.
Okay, I thought so.
Yes. Yes. There's a little crossover.
Okay.
Yeah, there's a little crossover. I see that Frank has, oh, Frank gave me a message. Hang on just a little bit. You think, boy. Oh, that's nice. Thank you, Frank.
All right. Good night, all.
Yeah. Good night. Thank you so much, John. This was
Thank you,
so
Ruth.
much
Thanks
fun.
so much. Yeah.
Yeah, this was so
It's
much
great.
fun. Thank you, everybody.